Hello. So we will begin by reading a very basic book by starting right at the basics. We'll be reading William J. Bennett's The Book of Virtue. See if you can see it there. It's a very hefty book. A lot of material is covered in this book. And this book is very interesting because it's not a nonfiction book, or not strictly a nonfiction book. It's actually a collection of a mixture of stories and short nonfiction essays. And so we have Greek myths, ancient myths from all over. That's not true. This directly gets its material from the Western canon. So we're going to have ancient Greek myths. We're going to have as well, folklore, tall tales, things like that. In the intro, he even mentions George Washington's cherry tree, and I only vaguely remember what that is. So that might be nice reading. And so this is overall a very good starting point, and it's built that way because it is guided towards children. This book is essentially about aiding the moral education of children, and we're all children to a certain respect when it comes to this. We haven't had proper moral education. Not to say that this book necessarily holds all there is to say about moral education, about morality, or even if it's a good book in and of itself, but definitely is a place to start with, especially when it's so open-ended. That could be that's a tricky issue, but at the very least, it's open to the interpretation that you are afforded when reading fiction. And very simple fiction, very short fiction. These are things that children could read. And also, the very interesting thing about this book is that each chapter is divided about a core theme, about a core virtue. That's not the interesting part. But what is interesting is that it gets progressively harder, not in subsequent chapters, but within the chapter itself. The beginning of a chapter is going to be easy, and the last passage, the last story, is going to be hard. And those harder ones start to spread multiple pages rather than just one single short story, one page. Even a couple of poems are in this. So it's a variety of different messages or different mediums, different ways of saying similar messages. And it's also accessible for all ages because it separates it between progressively easier to progressively harder. And so the general instructions that the author gives is to not read it cover to cover. And so we will be following that in a modified fashion. But before we get too ahead of ourselves, let's talk about the book itself. So like I said, this is an aid to the education of the youth, the moral education of the youth, and a couple not throwaway lines, but a couple key sentences towards the start of the introduction. He explains that proper moral education requires the creation of habits, requires practice. Morality isn't just about problem solving or implying principles from more complex principles from simpler principles. It's not an intellectual endeavor. It is a practical endeavor. And this goes back to Plato, where he points out that just because you know the good or you know the bad doesn't mean that you're going to do the good and not do the bad. Because, human beings are imperfect creatures and we have lapses of judgment, etc. So it's a really big focus, action itself. Another really important key about this, about the practical wisdom and the lived ethics, is his claim that moral education, should follow moral examples. Usually these are moral individuals. Once again, going back to Aristotle, it's about learning from those who actually behave ethically. You could derive information just simply by them acting. You could analyze their behaviors, see what they do, see what they don't do, and figure things out for yourself. And that really is the approach of this book in its content because of fiction. Even though fictional characters don't exist and these events didn't happen, we could nonetheless draw lessons from them, things that you should do, things that you should not do. And you're able to recognize this if the characters have a good ending or a bad ending. And this is immediately accessible to children as well. It's not this high intellectual abstractions. It is viscerally based on a narrative, and a simple narrative. A key assumption here, basically the reason he believes these things, is that moral values or proper moral understanding has to be taught, and that it's not innate. It doesn't come automatically to you. It's not self-evident. It actually has to be taught. So that's very interesting, and I'm not sure if I believe one way or the other. I tend to think it's a mix of both, but either way, I think that this is a very sound method that the author is going to be using for this book. Now, he gives a couple more justifications, particularly about the use of stories and, of course, related to the subject of children. So the first reason why this is a good idea is that we need specific reference points when we talk about morality. This goes back to the idea of having an example. That way we could truly see what's going on. We could revisit things if we have to. We could reanalyze it. It's not just about a whole bunch of different predictions of what could happen. It's not like some kind of calculation, which is what the author identifies as a new trend in education, moral education, called moral reasoning. Now, I'm not exactly certain where he's getting that term from, but I do have some knowledge of what this might mean. So in developmental psychology, there was a theory by Piaget that basically said that children progress in their ability to think abstractly about the physical world as they progress through, as they develop more of their brain as they get older. And so basically, it was also his opinion and someone else's named Colbert, Lawrence Colbert, if I am correct. But they were essentially, they were of the opinion that children would progress morally as well, and that the more they lived, the more experiences they would achieve, and the more actual understanding about abstract principles, the easier it would be for them to think in these terms because their brain is more developed. And they go into some very radical conclusions, saying that any authority figure, any teacher, is essentially an obstacle to children because it limits their range of experimentation in the same way that someone would experiment with the natural world in order to gain more scientific knowledge. They thought that having a guiding hand and having authority was a limitation for the development of the children morally. And essentially, this general principle goes down to when we talk about experimentation and kids experimenting about the social world, about the moral world, it tends to be about looking at things in other people's point of views, putting on their shoes and seeing what they see. And when it comes to morality, in a lot of these cases, the default is this care-harm principle. And that you don't want bad things done to you, and you want good things done to you. And so then you realize that other people have things that are better for them and worse for them. And for Colbert, the sign that children were more developed morally was when they could put themselves and see other people's perspectives, and then essentially do this kind of calculation, this utilitarian calculation, to see where there is the most benefit and the least harm and all these things. And that's not really a virtue as Bennett is describing it. He's talking about characteristics of a person. It's more about values, whereas in moral reasoning, it's just the only value is harm. And so that's the first reason, that this is a more natural way of doing these things, a more correct way of doing these things, and also a And the reason it's correct, it's because it's concrete, and you could see it from an example. These stories, when you read them, you're able to understand and able to know how to promote these good things. This is something that he says, right? When you look at the story, it's also about understanding that these principles can be derived, that these things are objective, and that you can find them if you basically analyze actions. And also that it could be promoted. You understand how to do it yourself. It's not just a calculation and then you work towards it. The calculation, you could say, is the actual process, the actual doing of the act. There is no distinction between ends and means. They're the same thing under virtue ethics. Well, that's my general opinion so far, a semi-informed opinion. Now, the other point, this goes more directly towards children. Stories are exciting, and they're going to remember it better because it's going to leave a bigger impression in their head. And these early times are very important for establishing good habits and establishing the foundation of the human being. The other reason would be that it connects these children to the broader culture, and it connects us to the broader culture. I'm sure that I'm going to read a whole bunch of books that I've never, or rather short stories that I've never heard of. And that this really you're able to specifically understand your culture in a more historical way, to understand the traditions of the culture. That's what Bennett says. And that feeds into the last point, which is basically that you're going to connect the child to a common moral community, you could say. So it's not an individualistic pursuit. It's something that makes them feel part of a larger project. And essentially, ethics is also about working in society and interacting with other people and your duties to other people. And so it's a more embodied form of ethics. And that goes back to the main point in the start. So essentially, this book is it's going to be very basic, and we're going to follow his instructions of not reading it cover to cover. So we are going to read the first story, the first passage of each chapter, one after another. And I'm going to make a video on each passage. Some of them are going to be very short, others are going to be longer. But I'm going to make one video for each passage, and we're going to go from chapter 1 to chapter 10 all the way back to chapter 1, and then we're going to start on the second passage of chapter 1. And so we're going to basically cover all the easy text first, and then the last videos are going to be all the hard ones. And so I think that's a good way of organizing it as well. I'm gonna be reading other works in the middle of this. So we are going to take a more casual reading pace for this one. But I think I could still read 4 stories in one sitting and then read something else besides. I think that could be done. So we're not going to go snail's pace, but it's going to be lingering a little bit more. And that's essentially it.